The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as King Charles III prepared for what would become his 500th official engagement since ascending to the throne. The number itself was significant, a milestone that the palace had been quietly tracking, though they had chosen not to make it a public celebration. Charles himself seemed unaware of the numerical significance as he reviewed his schedule over breakfast, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he studied the day's agenda. Sarah Morrison, his private secretary, had arrived early that morning with a stack of briefing papers. She had served the royal family for over 15 years, having started during the final years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. Sarah possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate the king's needs and had developed a deep understanding of his character, his strengths, his passions, and, increasingly, his limitations. "Your Majesty," Sarah began carefully as she placed the morning tea beside his elbow, "today's engagement at the Veterans Hospital is particularly important. The media attention will be significant, given that it's your 500th official appearance." Charles looked up from his papers, a slight frown crossing his weathered features. 500th? Has it really been that many? He set down his cup with a gentle clink against the saucer. Time moves strangely when one is in this position. The weight in his voice was unmistakable. At 75, Charles had waited longer than any heir in British history to become king. The crown had come to him at an age when most men were well into retirement, and the demands of the monarchy were proving more challenging than he had anticipated, despite decades of preparation. Standing near the window, Captain James Mitchell of the King's Guard observed the exchange with the quiet attention that had become his trademark. James had been assigned to the King's personal protection detail 6 months earlier, and, in that time, he had noticed subtle changes in the monarch's demeanor. The enthusiasm that Charles brought to his environmental causes and charitable work remained strong, but there were moments, brief glimpses, when the weight of his responsibilities seemed almost overwhelming. James was 38 years old, a decorated soldier who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Royal Protection Service. He had seen enough of life to recognize when someone was struggling, even when that someone wore a crown and maintained a public facade of unwavering strength. His military training had taught him to observe, to anticipate, and to act when necessary. But his human instincts told him that the king was carrying burdens that went far beyond the ceremonial demands of his role. The drive to the Veterans Hospital took them through the busy streets of London, where crowds had gathered despite the grey October weather. Charles waved mechanically from the back seat of the Rolls-Royce, his smile practiced and genuine simultaneously. This was one of the paradoxes of royal life that James had come to understand: emotions could be both authentic and performed at the same time. "The veterans appreciate these visits more than most people realize," Charles said quietly to Sarah as they navigated through traffic. "During my time as Prince of Wales, I saw how much it meant to them. Now, as king..." He paused, gazing out at the gathering crowds. "I sometimes wonder if I'm living up to what they expect." Sarah reached across to touch his hand briefly, a gesture that would never be seen by the public but spoke volumes about the human relationships that existed behind the royal facade. "Your Majesty, your dedication to our servicemen and women has never been questioned. They see that dedication." James, sitting in the front passenger seat, listened to this exchange while maintaining his professional vigilance. Through the rearview mirror, he caught sight of the king's reflection and noticed something that concerned him: a slight tremor in Charles's left hand that hadn't been there at the beginning of the journey. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but James's trained eye caught it immediately. The hospital visit began as these events typically did, with a formal reception line, brief presentations about the facility's work, and carefully choreographed meetings with selected patients. Charles moved through the routine with practiced ease, but James noticed that the king seemed to be gripping his walking stick more tightly than usual. The stick itself was a beautiful piece, a gift from the Commonwealth nations, but today it appeared to be serving a more practical purpose than ceremonial. In the rehabilitation ward, Charles spent time with young soldiers who had lost limbs in combat. These conversations were always deeply moving, both for the king and for the veterans themselves. Charles had a remarkable ability to connect with people who had served their country, drawing on his own military experience and his genuine respect for their sacrifices. "Your Majesty," said Lieutenant David Thompson, a 26-year-old who had lost his right leg in an explosion in Syria. "It means everything that you're here. Sometimes we feel forgotten by the world outside." Charles sat beside the young man's bed, his official posture relaxing into something more natural and grandfatherly. "You are never forgotten, David. Never. Your service, your sacrifice, it matters more than you know." The king's voice carried genuine emotion, and James could see that these interactions energized him in a way that formal ceremonies did not. As they moved through the ward, meeting with more veterans and their families, James maintained his protective watch while also keeping a careful eye on the king's physical condition. The tremor in his hand had not worsened, but it also had not disappeared. More concerning was the way Charles occasionally paused between conversations, as if gathering strength for the next interaction. The hospital's chief administrator, Dr. Patricia Wells, had arranged for the visit to conclude with a brief tour of the facility's new prosthetics laboratory. The technology was impressive 3D printing capabilities that could create custom limbs with remarkable precision and functionality. Charles showed genuine interest in the technical details, asking questions that demonstrated his engagement with the subject matter. "This is extraordinary," he said, examining a prosthetic hand that could respond to neural impulses. "When I think of what was available even 10 years ago, the progress is remarkable." He turned to Dr. Wells with an expression of sincere admiration. "You're not just healing bodies here, you're restoring hope." It was during this moment of genuine enthusiasm that the first sign of trouble appeared. As Charles reached out to examine another piece of equipment, his coordination seemed momentarily off. The movement was awkward, uncertain in a way that was entirely uncharacteristic for a man who had spent decades in public life. James stepped slightly closer, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio, though he couldn't yet identify what, exactly, was wrong. Sarah, too, seemed to notice something amiss, her expression shifting from professional pleasantness to subtle concern. The tour continued, but James could see that each step was requiring more effort from the king. Charles's conversation remained engaging and appropriate, but there was a quality to his voice that suggested he was working harder than usual to maintain his composure. The walking stick, which had started the day as an accessory, was now clearly providing necessary support. As they prepared to leave the prosthetics lab and move to the final stop of the visit, a meeting with the hospital's executive board, Charles paused at the doorway. The pause lasted perhaps 3 seconds longer than would be considered normal, and, in those 3 seconds, James saw something in the king's eyes that made his pulse quicken. It wasn't fear, exactly, but rather a kind of disorientation, as if Charles was momentarily unsure of where he was or what came next in his carefully planned day. The expression passed quickly, replaced by the familiar mask of royal composure, but James had seen enough combat to recognize when someone was fighting an internal battle. Sarah appeared at Charles's elbow, ostensibly to brief him about the upcoming meeting but, actually to provide subtle support. "The board members are particularly interested in your thoughts about expanding the program to other hospitals," she said smoothly, giving him a clear direction for the next conversation. "Yes, of course," Charles replied, his voice steady again. "The potential for expansion is exactly what I wanted to discuss with them." But, as they walked toward the conference room where the hospital board was waiting, James noticed that the king's gait had changed. The confident stride that had carried him through thousands of public appearances over the decades had become more measured, more careful. Each step seemed deliberate in a way that suggested concentration rather than natural movement. The meeting with the hospital board proceeded normally on the surface. Charles discussed funding opportunities, expressed his support for expanding the prosthetics program, and answered questions about the royal family's ongoing commitment to veteran care. His responses were thoughtful and well-informed, drawing on his extensive experience with military charities and his genuine passion for supporting those who had served their country. Dr. Wells presented him with a commemorative plaque recognizing his long-standing support for veterans' causes. As Charles stood to receive it, James positioned himself slightly closer than protocol would normally dictate, operating on an instinct he couldn't quite name but had learned never to ignore. "Your Majesty," Dr. Wells said as she handed over the plaque, "your visits mean more to our patients than you might realize. Many of them speak about these interactions for months afterward." Charles accepted the plaque with both hands, but James noticed that his grip seemed less secure than it should be. The king's smile remained warm and genuine, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was working harder than usual to maintain his balance. "The honor is mine entirely," Charles replied. "The courage I see in these young men and women, it humbles me every time I visit. They remind me why public service matters." As the formal presentations concluded and the group prepared to move toward the exit, James made a decision that would later prove crucial. Instead of maintaining his usual position slightly behind and to the left of the king, he moved to Charles's right side close enough to provide assistance if needed, but not so close as to suggest that assistance might be necessary. The final portion of the visit involved a brief walkthrough of the hospital's main corridor, where staff members and a few select patients had gathered to say goodbye. Charles moved through this informal receiving line with characteristic warmth, shaking hands and exchanging brief words with each person. But James could see that the effort was becoming increasingly difficult. The king's responses, while still appropriate and kind, were coming slightly slower than usual. His handshakes, normally firm and confident, seemed to require conscious effort. Most telling of all, he had begun to rely more heavily on his walking stick with each step. Sarah, walking slightly behind them, caught James's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. She, too, had noticed the subtle changes in the king's condition. Her expression remained professionally pleasant, but James could see the concern in her eyes. As they approached the hospital's main entrance, where a small crowd of well-wishers had gathered outside, Charles paused again. This time, the pause was longer, perhaps 5 seconds, and his expression showed a momentary confusion that couldn't be disguised by royal training. "Your Majesty?" Sarah said quietly, stepping to his side. "The car is just outside." Charles blinked, and the confusion cleared. "Yes, of course. Thank you, Sarah." He turned to Dr. Wells, who had accompanied them to the entrance. "Thank you for an extraordinary visit. The work you're doing here is truly remarkable." The automatic doors slid open, revealing the crowd of perhaps 50 people who had braved the gray October afternoon to catch a glimpse of their king. Charles straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin, and stepped forward to greet them with a wave and a smile. For a moment, he seemed to draw strength from their enthusiasm, his movements becoming more natural and confident. But James remained alert, his eyes constantly scanning both the crowd and the king, ready to respond to any change in the situation. He had learned to trust his instincts, and those instincts were telling him that this day was far from over. As Charles moved along the impromptu receiving line, shaking hands and accepting flowers from children, James positioned himself strategically to provide maximum protection while remaining as unobtrusive as possible. The king's interaction with the crowd was genuine and warm, but James could see that each smile, each handshake, each gracious word was requiring more effort than it should. The October wind picked up, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sound of London traffic. In the crowd, mobile phones captured every moment, every gesture, every expression. By evening, these images would be analyzed by royal watchers around the world, looking for signs of health, happiness, or strain. But none of those distant observers would see what James was seeing, the small signs that something was not quite right with the man who wore the crown. Only those closest to Charles in that moment could sense that beneath the royal composure, a quiet struggle was taking place. As they finally reached the waiting Rolls-Royce, James moved to open the door, positioning himself to offer assistance without making it obvious that assistance might be needed. Charles paused for one final wave to the crowd, his smile as warm and genuine as it had been at the beginning of the day. "Thank you all for coming," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the hospital forecourt. "Your support means more than you know." But, as he turned toward the car, James saw something that made his blood run cold, a subtle wavering in the king's stance, a momentary uncertainty that spoke of a man whose body was no longer quite obeying his commands. The 500th engagement was drawing to a close, but James had the distinct feeling that the most challenging part of this day was still ahead of them. The journey back to Windsor Castle should have been routine, a peaceful 40-minute drive through the English countryside that Charles typically used to decompress from public engagements. Today, however, the familiar comfort of the Rolls-Royce's leather interior felt different. James noticed immediately that the king's usual post-event energy was absent. Instead of his customary review of the day's highlights with Sarah, Charles sat quietly in the back seat, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape but his eyes seemingly focused on nothing at all. Sarah attempted to engage him in conversation about the hospital visit, hoping to capture his thoughts for the official record while they were still fresh. "Your Majesty, Dr. Wells mentioned that the prosthetics program could be expanded to 3 additional hospitals by next year. Would you like me to arrange follow-up meetings?" Charles turned toward her with what appeared to be genuine effort. Yes, that would be good." the young soldiers deserve every advantage we can give them." His words were appropriate and heartfelt, but his delivery lacked the enthusiasm that typically characterized his discussions about veteran care. James, monitoring both the road ahead and the back seat through the rearview mirror, noticed that the king's left hand was now resting heavily on his walking stick. The slight tremor he had observed earlier seemed to have intensified, though Charles appeared to be trying to control it by gripping the stick's handle more firmly. "Perhaps we could also explore funding opportunities through the Prince's Trust Network," Sarah continued, though James could hear the subtle concern creeping into her voice. "The rehabilitation technology we saw today could benefit from additional investment." "Absolutely," Charles replied, but then he paused, his brow furrowing as if he were struggling to organize his thoughts. "The technology, it was remarkable. The way they're able to help these young people reclaim their independence." The pause was longer than comfortable, and James saw Sarah glance toward the front of the car, her expression betraying her growing worry. In 15 years of service, she had rarely seen the king struggle to articulate his thoughts about subjects that were close to his heart. As they drove through the countryside, the October afternoon was fading into early evening. The trees that lined the road displayed the full glory of autumn, brilliant oranges, deep reds, and golden yellows that normally would have captured Charles's attention completely. His lifelong love of nature and his artistic eye typically made these drives an opportunity for quiet observation and reflection. Today, however, he seemed unaware of the seasonal display outside his window. His gaze remained unfocused, and James noticed that his breathing had become slightly more labored than usual. It wasn't dramatic enough to cause immediate alarm, but it was noticeable to someone trained to observe such details. "Your Majesty," Sarah said gently, "are you feeling quite well? Today was particularly demanding." Charles looked at her with an expression that seemed to require considerable effort to focus. Yes, I'm fine, Sarah. Just tired, I suppose. These engagements can be more tiring than they used to be." The admission was significant. Throughout his decades of public service, first as Prince of Wales and now as King, Charles had rarely acknowledged physical limitations. His commitment to duty had always superseded personal discomfort, and he had maintained a schedule that would challenge people half his age. James made a subtle adjustment to their route, choosing roads that would provide a smoother ride while appearing to make no change to their planned journey. His military training had taught him to anticipate problems before they became critical, and every instinct was telling him that the king's condition was more serious than simple fatigue. "Perhaps when we return to Windsor, you might consider canceling this evening's engagements," Sarah suggested carefully. "The meeting with the environmental ministers could be rescheduled, and the dinner with the Commonwealth representatives isn't until Thursday." "Cancel?" Charles's voice carried a note of surprise, as if the suggestion were foreign to him. No, I don't think that's necessary. A brief rest, perhaps, but cancel, that wouldn't be appropriate." James watched as Charles attempted to straighten his posture, clearly trying to project his usual image of strength and capability. But the effort seemed to cost him considerable energy, and, within moments, he had settled back into his previous position, leaning more heavily against the seat's support. The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle hum of the car's engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. Sarah worked quietly on her tablet, updating the day's official record and discreetly checking the king's schedule for the remainder of the week. James could see her occasionally glancing up to observe Charles, her professional concern becoming increasingly evident. As they approached the outskirts of Windsor, James noticed something that made his pulse quicken. In the rearview mirror, he could see that Charles's eyes had closed, not in peaceful rest but with an expression that suggested he was fighting against something: pain, disorientation, or simple exhaustion. "Your Majesty?" Sarah said softly. Charles opened his eyes immediately, but there was a momentary confusion in his gaze that was deeply unsettling. "I'm sorry, Sarah. Did you say something?" "We're nearly back to Windsor. I was wondering if you'd like tea served in your study when we arrive." "Tea, yes, that would be lovely." Charles's response was appropriate, but his voice lacked conviction, as if he were struggling to remember what tea was or why he might want it. James made another decision that would prove crucial to the events that followed. Instead of taking the car directly to the main entrance of Windsor Castle, where protocol would normally require a formal arrival, he drove toward the private entrance used by the royal family for informal comings and goings. This route would provide greater privacy and would allow him to assess the king's condition without the scrutiny of additional staff. As they pulled through the familiar gates, Charles seemed to rally slightly, perhaps drawing comfort from the sight of his home. "It's been a good day," he said, though his voice carried an uncertain quality. "The veterans, they deserve so much more than we can give them." "Your support means everything to them," Sarah replied, closing her tablet and gathering her papers. "The work you're doing makes a real difference in their lives." Charles nodded, but James noticed that the gesture seemed to require conscious effort, as if even this simple movement had become difficult. As the car came to a stop outside the private entrance, James quickly exited and moved to open the king's door, positioning himself to provide assistance while maintaining the appearance of normal protocol. Charles emerged from the car slowly, gripping his walking stick with both hands as he found his footing on the gravel. For a moment, he stood still, seemingly gathering strength for the short walk to the castle entrance. His breathing was more noticeable now, not labored exactly, but deliberate in a way that suggested concentration. "Your Majesty," James said quietly, moving to his right side, "may I escort you inside?" Charles looked at him with an expression that showed both gratitude and a kind of resignation. "Yes, James. Thank you. That would be helpful." The admission was perhaps the most telling moment of the entire day. For a man who had spent 75 years projecting strength and independence, acknowledging that he needed help represented a significant shift in his internal landscape. Sarah fell into step beside them, her concern now openly visible. She had served the royal family long enough to understand the significance of what she was witnessing. Kings and queens, even in their most private moments, rarely showed vulnerability so clearly. The walk to the castle's private entrance, which normally would take perhaps 30 seconds, stretched to nearly 2 minutes. Charles moved carefully, deliberately, each step planned and executed with visible effort. His walking stick, which had started the day as a ceremonial accessory, had become genuinely necessary for his mobility. Inside the castle's familiar corridors, Charles seemed to gain a small measure of confidence. The portraits of his ancestors gazed down from their frames, and the weight of history that these walls contained appeared to provide some comfort. But James could see that even this short journey was taxing the king's remaining energy. "I think I will rest before this evening's appointments," Charles said as they reached the corridor leading to his private study. "Perhaps an hour or so." Sarah and James exchanged glances. An hour of rest was hardly sufficient preparation for an evening of official duties, especially given what they had observed throughout the afternoon. "Your Majesty," Sarah began carefully, "given the demands of today's schedule, perhaps we might consider—" She was interrupted by Charles stopping abruptly in the corridor. His face had gone pale, and his grip on his walking stick had become so tight that his knuckles were white. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, he stood perfectly still, as if afraid that any movement might precipitate something catastrophic. "Sir?" James said quietly, moving closer without appearing to crowd him. Charles's eyes met his, and, in that moment, James saw something that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't just physical distress, it was the look of a man who suddenly understood that his body might no longer be entirely under his control. I think I might need to." Charles began, but the sentence trailed off as if he had forgotten what he was trying to say. James reacted with the swift decision-making that had served him well in combat situations. Without waiting for permission or protocol, he moved to Charles's side and offered his arm for support. "Let's get you to your study, sir. You can rest there." Charles accepted the assistance without protest, which in itself was a clear indication of how seriously his condition had deteriorated. Together, they made their way down the corridor, James providing steady support while Sarah hurried ahead to ensure that the king's study was prepared for their arrival. The study itself was a reflection of Charles's lifelong interests, filled with books about architecture, environmental science, and history, as well as his own watercolor paintings of landscapes and botanical subjects. Normally, this room served as a sanctuary where he could pursue his intellectual interests away from the demands of public life. Today, it would serve a very different purpose. James helped Charles to his favorite armchair, a well-worn piece that had belonged to his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother. As Charles settled into its familiar embrace, some of the tension seemed to leave his shoulders, but his pallor remained concerning. "Shall I call for the royal physician?" Sarah asked, her professional composure finally giving way to open worry. Charles looked up at her with an expression that mixed stubbornness with genuine fear. "I don't think that's necessary. Just give me a few minutes. I'm sure I'll be fine." But, even as he said the words, James could see that Charles himself didn't believe them. The tremor in his left hand had become more pronounced, and there was a quality to his breathing that suggested his body was working harder than it should to maintain basic functions. James made another crucial decision. Moving to the window that overlooked the castle's private gardens, he positioned himself where he could maintain visual contact with the king while also accessing his communication equipment. If the situation deteriorated further, he would need to act quickly. Sarah busied herself with preparing tea, but James could see that her movements were driven more by nervous energy than by any real belief that tea would solve the current crisis. Her 15 years of service had prepared her for many scenarios, but watching the king struggle with what appeared to be a serious medical episode was uncharted territory. As the minutes passed, Charles's condition seemed to stabilize somewhat, though he remained pale and appeared exhausted. His conversation, when he spoke at all, was limited to brief responses to Sarah's gentle inquiries about his comfort. "The engagement went well, don't you think?" Sarah asked, attempting to redirect his attention to positive memories from the day. "Yes," Charles replied, but his voice was distant. "The young soldiers, they're so brave. Much braver than I am." The comment was revealing in its vulnerability. Throughout his public life, Charles had consistently demonstrated physical and moral courage in challenging situations. To hear him question his own bravery suggested that he was grappling with fears that went far beyond the immediate physical symptoms he was experiencing. James, still positioned by the window, found himself thinking about the weight of responsibility that rested on the shoulders of the man sitting in that armchair. The crown wasn't just a symbol, it represented the expectations of an entire nation, the continuity of an ancient institution, and the hopes and dreams of millions of people who looked to the monarchy for stability and leadership. At 75, Charles was carrying that weight at an age when most people were focused on their grandchildren and their gardens. The irony wasn't lost on James that the king's greatest passion, environmental conservation and sustainable living, required him to think in terms of decades and centuries, while his own physical capabilities were reminding him daily of the limitations of human life. As the afternoon light faded outside the study windows, James began to suspect that this day would mark a turning point in the king's reign. The 500th engagement, which should have been a celebration of dedication and service, had instead become a stark reminder of mortality and limitation. The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of additional staff, and James saw Sarah discreetly motion for them to remain at a distance. The king's condition was not yet something that could be shared with the broader household, but James knew that decisions would need to be made soon about the evening's scheduled events. Charles appeared to be dozing in his chair, his breathing having settled into a more regular pattern, but his hand continued to tremble against the armrest. James remained alert, ready to respond to any change in the king's condition while also beginning to formulate plans for various scenarios that might unfold over the next few hours. The castle's ancient walls had witnessed many moments of crisis and triumph over the centuries, and James found himself wondering what history would make of this particular afternoon. Would it be remembered as the day when age finally caught up with a dedicated monarch, or would it become just another footnote in the long story of royal service and sacrifice? As evening approached and the first decisions about canceling engagements would need to be made, James knew that the next few hours would test not just the king's physical resilience, but the entire support system that surrounded the modern monarchy. The evening shadows grew longer across the Windsor Castle grounds as James maintained his quiet vigil by the study window. Charles had been resting in his armchair for nearly an hour, though his sleep appeared fitful and was punctuated by small movements and occasional murmurs that suggested his rest was anything but peaceful. Sarah had positioned herself at the king's desk, ostensibly working on correspondence but actually keeping a careful watch on her sovereign's condition. The normal rhythm of castle life continued around them, staff preparing for the evening's planned engagements, security personnel conducting their routine patrols, and the various administrative functions that kept the monarchy operating smoothly. But, within the confines of the king's study, time seemed suspended as three people grappled with a situation that none of them had been fully prepared for. James's radio crackled softly with routine communications from other members of the security detail, but he kept the volume low to avoid disturbing Charles's rest. His military experience had taught him to gather information continuously, even during periods of apparent calm, and he found himself mentally reviewing the resources available within the castle should the king's condition require immediate medical attention. Dr. Margaret Henley, the royal physician, was currently at her practice in London but could be reached within minutes and could arrive at Windsor within an hour if necessary. The castle's medical facility, while not equipped for major emergency procedures, was well stocked and staffed for handling various health situations. Most importantly, the relationship between Windsor Castle and the nearest major hospital had been carefully coordinated to ensure rapid response to any royal medical emergency. But James also understood that the decision to involve medical professionals would need to come from either Charles himself or from someone with the authority to override the king's wishes. The delicate balance between respect for royal autonomy and concern for royal welfare was something that every member of the household staff navigated daily, but never more carefully than in situations involving health concerns. Sarah looked up from her work, caught James's eye, and gestured subtly toward the door. Moving quietly, they both stepped into the corridor just outside the study, where they could speak in whispers without disturbing the king's rest. "In 15 years of service, I've never seen him like this," Sarah said, her professional composure finally giving way to genuine worry. The tremor in his hand, the confusion, these aren't symptoms of simple exhaustion. James nodded grimly. "My father had similar symptoms in the early stages of Parkinson's disease. I'm not suggesting that's what this is, but we're clearly dealing with something more serious than fatigue." The evening schedule includes dinner with the environmental ministers at 7:30, followed by a private meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury at 9 o'clock, Sarah continued. "Both are important commitments, but, given what we've observed today, they'll need to be cancelled," James said firmly. "The king's health takes precedence over any diplomatic or official consideration." Sarah's expression showed both relief and concern. "The decision isn't ours to make, though. His Majesty has always insisted on fulfilling his obligations, regardless of personal discomfort. Convincing him to cancel official engagements will require delicate handling." They returned to the study to find Charles stirring in his chair. His color appeared slightly better than it had been an hour earlier, but James noticed immediately that the tremor in his left hand had not improved during his rest. "Sarah?" Charles said, his voice carrying more strength than it had earlier but still lacking his usual vitality. "What time is it? I feel as though I'd been sleeping for hours." "It's just past 6 o'clock, Your Majesty," Sarah replied gently. "You've been resting for about an hour." Charles attempted to rise from his chair but found the movement more difficult than expected. James moved immediately to offer assistance, extending his arm in a way that provided support while preserving the king's dignity. "The dinner with the environmental ministers," Charles said as he gained his footing. "I should prepare for that. The climate initiatives we're discussing tonight could influence policy for years to come." Sarah and James exchanged glances. Charles's commitment to environmental causes had been a driving force throughout his adult life, and his passion for these issues often gave him energy even when he was physically struggling. But, today, even the prospect of discussing his most cherished causes seemed insufficient to fully restore his usual dynamism. "Your Majesty," Sarah began carefully, "given the demands of today's engagement and your need for rest, perhaps we might consider rescheduling this evening's appointments." Charles looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise with something approaching dismay. "Reschedule? But these ministers have traveled considerable distances to be here. The Archbishop has adjusted his own schedule to accommodate our meeting. I can't simply cancel because I'm feeling tired." The word tired hung in the air, inadequate to describe what they had all observed but apparently the only term Charles was willing to apply to his condition. James decided to take a more direct approach. "Sir, with respect, what we observed today went beyond simple fatigue. Your safety, and the safety of your guests, requires that we consider all factors when making decisions about official engagements." Charles turned toward him with a sharp look that reminded James of the military commanders he had served under, men accustomed to having their decisions questioned only under extraordinary circumstances. "My safety, Captain Mitchell?" Charles's voice carried a note of authority that had been absent for most of the afternoon. "I've been conducting official engagements for over 50 years. I think I'm capable of determining what I can and cannot handle." The rebuke was gentle but clear, and James recognized that he had perhaps overstepped the bounds of his role. However, his concern for the king's welfare outweighed his concern for protocol. "Of course, Your Majesty. I simply meant that the day's events suggest you might benefit from additional rest before resuming your official schedule." Sarah intervened with the diplomatic skill that had made her invaluable to the royal household. "Perhaps we might compromise, Your Majesty. The dinner with the environmental ministers could proceed as planned, but we might consider shortening the evening and postponing the meeting with the Archbishop until tomorrow." Charles considered this suggestion, his hand gripping his walking stick as he appeared to weigh his options. James could see that even this brief conversation had tired him, though the king was working hard to conceal his continued fatigue. "Very well," Charles said finally. "We'll proceed with the dinner but reschedule the Archbishop. Though I don't want him to think that his visit is unimportant to me." "I'll speak with his office personally," Sarah assured him. "They'll understand that Your Majesty's health is the priority." As they prepared to leave the study for the king's private apartments, where he would change for dinner, James noticed that Charles's gait remained unsteady. The hour of rest had provided some recovery, but the fundamental issues that had emerged during their return from the hospital visit were still evident. The walk to the king's apartments required navigating several corridors and a flight of stairs. Charles managed the journey, but James remained close at hand, ready to provide assistance if needed. The king's valet, Thomas, was waiting in the apartments with the evening's formal wear laid out and ready. "Thomas," Sarah said quietly, drawing the valet aside while Charles entered his dressing room. "His Majesty has had a particularly demanding day. Please ensure that his preparation for this evening's dinner is as comfortable as possible." Thomas, who had served Charles for over a decade, understood immediately. His experienced eye would recognize any signs of distress, and his discretion was absolute. Within the royal household, protecting the monarch's privacy and dignity was considered both a professional duty and a personal honor. While Charles prepared for dinner, Sarah and James retreated to a small sitting room adjacent to the apartments. This room, traditionally used for brief meetings and private conversations, provided them with a space to discuss the practical considerations that the evening's modified schedule would require. "The environmental ministers will need to be briefed about the shortened evening," Sarah said, opening her tablet to review the guest list. "They're expecting a formal dinner followed by a working session that could last until nearly midnight. Can we restructure the evening to accomplish the same objectives in less time?" James asked. "Possibly. The primary focus is supposed to be the renewable energy initiative for the Commonwealth nations. If we eliminate some of the ceremonial elements and focus on the substantive discussions, we might complete the essential work in half the time." James found himself impressed once again by Sarah's ability to adapt complex arrangements to changing circumstances. Her years of experience had taught her to think creatively about protocol while never losing sight of the underlying purposes that royal engagements were designed to serve. "There's another consideration," James said quietly. "If His Majesty's condition worsens during the dinner, we need to have contingency plans in place. The presence of foreign dignitaries will make any emergency response more complicated." Sarah nodded grimly. "Dr. Henley should be contacted and asked to remain on call this evening. She doesn't need to be at the castle, but she should be available to respond quickly if needed. I'll also coordinate with the other security personnel to ensure we have medical emergency protocols in place that can be implemented discreetly if necessary." As they discussed these arrangements, both of them were acutely aware that they were planning for scenarios that neither of them wanted to consider. The possibility that the king might experience a medical emergency during an official dinner was exactly the kind of situation that royal protocol attempted to prevent through careful scheduling and health monitoring. Charles emerged from his dressing room 40 minutes later, transformed by formal attire and the power of royal presentation. The black dinner jacket, crisp white shirt, and carefully arranged decorations created an image of strength and authority that masked many of the concerns that had dominated the afternoon. But James's trained eye could still see the subtle signs of the king's continuing struggle. His posture, while formally correct, required visible effort to maintain. His left hand, though largely concealed by his position and the formal gloves, still showed slight tremor when he gestured. Most telling of all, his eyes carried a quality of concentration that suggested he was working harder than usual to project his customary image of royal composure. "I think that will do," Charles said, examining his reflection in a full-length mirror. "The ministers have come a considerable distance to discuss the renewable energy initiative. The least I can do is present myself appropriately." Sarah stepped forward with the evening's briefing materials. "Your Majesty, I've taken the liberty of streamlining the agenda to focus on the most essential elements. The working session has been shortened to allow for adequate rest afterward." Charles accepted the briefing folder but looked at Sarah with a mixture of gratitude and resignation. "I suppose my condition today has been more obvious than I hoped." It was the first time all day that he had openly acknowledged that something was wrong, and both Sarah and James felt a mixture of relief and concern at his admission. "Your Majesty," Sarah said gently, "your dedication to duty is never in question. Taking care of your health allows you to better serve in the long term." "My mother managed these demands well into her 90s, Charles replied, though his voice carried more sadness than determination. "I had hoped to show similar resilience." James found himself thinking about the weight of expectations that Charles carried, not just his own expectations for his performance as king, but the expectations of a nation that had watched Queen Elizabeth II maintain her duties with remarkable consistency for over 70 years. Living up to that standard would be challenging for anyone, but attempting to do so at 75, while dealing with what appeared to be emerging health issues, seemed almost impossibly difficult. "Your Majesty," James said quietly, "your service has already demonstrated remarkable dedication. Tonight's engagement is important, but it's not more important than your well-being." Charles looked at him with an expression that showed both appreciation and a kind of weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. "Thank you, James. Your concern means more than you know." As they prepared to leave for the state dining room, where the environmental ministers were already gathering, James positioned himself to provide maximum support while maintaining the appearance of normal protocol. The evening ahead would test not only the king's physical stamina but also his ability to fulfill the fundamental requirements of his role while managing what appeared to be a significant health challenge. The corridors leading to the state dining room were lined with portraits of previous monarchs, each of whom had faced their own crises and challenges during their reigns. As they walked past these historical figures, James found himself wondering how many of them had struggled with the tension between personal limitation and public duty that Charles was experiencing tonight. The sound of conversation and gentle laughter drifted from the state dining room as they approached, indicating that the evening's guests were in good spirits and looking forward to their discussions with the king. For them, this dinner represented an opportunity to influence environmental policy at the highest levels of government and to benefit from Charles's decades of experience in conservation and sustainability. They had no way of knowing that the man they were waiting to meet was fighting the most difficult battle of his long career in public service, the battle to maintain his effectiveness and dignity in the face of a body that was beginning to betray the strength of his spirit. As they paused outside the dining room doors, Charles straightened his shoulders one final time and looked at Sarah and James with determination that reminded them why he had earned respect throughout his decades of service. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying as much authority as he could muster, "shall we proceed?" The state dining room at Windsor Castle had witnessed centuries of diplomatic conversations, royal celebrations, and historic agreements. Tonight, as the environmental ministers from 6 Commonwealth nations gathered around the polished mahogany table, the room's gilded walls and crystal chandeliers provided a backdrop for what should have been a routine but important discussion about renewable energy initiatives. James positioned himself near the wall behind the king's chair, close enough to observe every detail of Charles's condition but far enough away to maintain the illusion of normal protocol. From this vantage point, he could see not only the king but also the reactions of the dinner guests, who had no idea that they were witnessing a monarch struggling with what appeared to be a significant health crisis. The dinner began well enough. Charles, drawing upon decades of experience in diplomatic entertaining, managed to engage his guests with stories about his environmental initiatives and questions about their own country's conservation efforts. His passion for these issues seemed to provide him with energy that had been absent for most of the day, and, for the first 30 minutes of the meal, James began to hope that the evening might proceed without incident. Dr. Patricia Sharma, the environmental minister from New Zealand, was describing her country's progress in geothermal energy development when James noticed the first sign of trouble. Charles had been following the conversation attentively, occasionally interjecting thoughtful questions or observations, but suddenly, his expression became distant, as if he were struggling to follow the thread of the discussion. "Your Majesty?" Dr. Sharma said gently, having paused in her presentation. Did you have a question about the geothermal data? Charles blinked, and James could see him working to refocus his attention. I'm sorry, Dr. Sharma. Please continue. The geothermal developments are quite fascinating. The recovery was smooth enough that most of the guests probably didn't notice anything amiss, but James caught the slight confusion in the king's eyes and the way his left hand gripped his water glass more tightly than necessary. Sarah, seated at the opposite end of the table where she could assist with the evening's logistics, also noticed the brief lapse. She discreetly signaled to the serving staff to expedite the meal service, hoping to shorten the evening without making the change obvious to the guests. As the main course was served, the conversation turned to the practical challenges of implementing renewable energy systems in developing nations. This was a topic close to Charles's heart, and James watched as the king seemed to rally his resources to contribute meaningfully to the discussion. The infrastructure challenges are significant, Charles said, his voice carrying more strength than it had moments earlier. But my experience with the Prince's Trust has shown me that innovation often emerges from constraint. When conventional solutions aren't available, people find remarkable alternatives. Dr. James Okonkwo from Nigeria nodded enthusiastically. Your Majesty, that perspective aligns perfectly with what we're seeing in rural electrification projects. Solar microgrids are allowing communities to bypass traditional power infrastructure entirely. Charles leaned forward with genuine interest, but James noticed that the movement seemed to require considerable effort. Tell me more about these microgrids, Dr. Okonkwo. The potential for replication across the Commonwealth could be enormous. For several minutes, the conversation flowed naturally as the ministers shared examples of innovative renewable energy projects from their respective countries. Charles participated actively, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights based on his extensive experience with environmental initiatives. But James could see that the effort was taking its toll. The king's responses were becoming slightly slower, and there were moments when he seemed to lose track of the conversation before catching up with visible concentration. The crisis came during dessert. Dr. Sharma was explaining a new wind energy project when Charles suddenly stopped eating, his fork halfway to his mouth. For a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, he sat perfectly still, his eyes unfocused and his breathing shallow. Sir? James said quietly, taking a step closer to the table. Charles didn't respond immediately. The tremor in his left hand, which had been barely noticeable throughout dinner, became pronounced enough that his water glass began to rattle against his plate. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from Trinidad, seated to the king's right, looked concerned but uncertain how to respond. The other ministers began to notice that something was wrong, though the nature of the problem wasn't immediately clear. James made the decision that would define the rest of his career in royal service. Moving swiftly but calmly, he approached the king's chair and knelt beside it, speaking in a voice low enough that only Charles could hear him clearly. Your Majesty, I need you to listen to my voice. You're safe, and everything is going to be all right, but I think we need to get you some medical attention. Charles turned toward James with an expression of profound confusion and fear. James? I'm not sure what's happening. I feel quite strange. The admission, made in front of foreign dignitaries, represented a complete abandonment of the royal composure that had been Charles's armor for over 7 decades. In that moment, he wasn't a king struggling with protocol, he was simply a 75-year-old man who was frightened and needed help. James rose and addressed the table with calm authority. Ladies and gentlemen, His Majesty is feeling unwell this evening. I'm going to escort him to his apartments where he can rest. Please continue your discussions with Ms. Morrison, who will be able to address any questions about the renewable energy initiatives. Sarah immediately understood her role and stood to take control of the situation. Dr. Sharma, Dr. Okonkwo, Dr. Rodriguez, His Majesty has asked me to ensure that your important work continues. Perhaps we might adjourn to the blue drawing room where we can review the technical specifications you've brought. The ministers, recognizing both the seriousness of the situation and the need for discretion, rose from their seats with expressions of concern and respect. Dr. Sharma approached James briefly. Captain, please convey our best wishes to His Majesty. If there's anything we can do. Thank you, Doctor. Your understanding and discretion are greatly appreciated. James helped Charles to his feet, offering his arm for support in a way that appeared protective rather than medical. The king accepted the assistance without protest, which was perhaps the clearest indication of how seriously his condition had deteriorated. The walk from the state dining room to Charles's apartments, which had taken considerable effort earlier in the evening, now seemed almost beyond the king's capabilities. James found himself providing increasing support with each step, while maintaining the appearance that he was simply escorting his sovereign in a normal manner. "James," Charles said quietly as they navigated the corridor, "I'm rather frightened."
This has never happened before. The admission was heartbreaking in its vulnerability. James had spent months observing the king's strength, his dedication, and his unwavering commitment to duty.
To see that strength falter so dramatically was profoundly moving.
"We're going to take care of you, sir. Dr.
Henley is already on her way, and you'll be feeling better very soon." As they reached the king's apartments, James helped Charles to his favorite chair in the sitting room. The king's pallor had worsened during the walk, and the tremor in his left hand had spread to affect his entire left arm.
"Should I call for Prince William?"
James asked, recognizing that the situation had progressed beyond what he and Sarah could manage alone. Charles looked up at him with eyes that showed both fear and determination.
"Not yet. Let's see what Dr. Henley says first. I don't want to alarm the family unnecessarily."
James understood the reasoning but also recognized that decisions about involving the royal family might need to be made regardless of the king's preferences. The heir to the throne had a right to know when his father's health was in crisis. Dr. Henley arrived within 20 minutes, her usually calm demeanor showing signs of the urgency with which she had responded to James's call. She immediately began a thorough examination of the king, asking questions about his symptoms and checking his vital signs with professional efficiency. "Your Majesty," she said after completing her initial assessment, "I believe you may be experiencing a neurological episode of some kind.
I'd like to arrange for you to be taken to hospital for more comprehensive testing." Charles's reaction was immediate and definitive. "Absolutely not. I will not be taken to hospital."
The publicity, the speculation, it would be devastating for the monarchy. Dr. Henley looked at James with an expression that conveyed both professional concern and understanding of the complex considerations surrounding royal medical care. "Your Majesty, while I understand your concerns, your symptoms suggest something that requires investigation beyond what I can provide here at the castle." The standoff that followed represented one of the fundamental tensions in royal life, the conflict between personal health and public responsibility. Charles's refusal to seek hospital treatment wasn't just stubbornness, it was based on a lifetime of understanding that royal medical emergencies became international news and could affect everything from financial markets to diplomatic relationships.
James found himself in an impossible position.
His duty was to protect the king, but Charles was clearly and rationally refusing the protection that James believed he needed.
"Your Majesty," James said finally, "what if we could arrange for the necessary medical equipment to be brought here?
Dr. Henley could conduct the tests she needs without the risks associated with a hospital visit."
Dr. Henley considered this suggestion. "Some tests could be performed here, though not all.
We could arrange for a portable CT scanner and other equipment within a few hours." Charles looked between James and Dr. Henley, his expression showing the exhaustion that came from fighting both his physical symptoms and the impossible choices they presented.
"Very well. But I want minimal staff involved, and I want absolute assurance that word of this doesn't reach the press." James spent the next several hours coordinating one of the most complex medical operations in Windsor Castle's history.
Medical equipment was transported discreetly from London hospitals, specialist physicians were brought in under conditions of absolute secrecy, and the castle's security was enhanced to ensure that no unauthorized information about the king's condition could leak to the outside world. Throughout the night, as tests were conducted and results analyzed, James maintained his vigil beside the king. Charles drifted in and out of sleep, but, when awake, he insisted on being briefed about the modified arrangements for the following day's scheduled engagements. "The opening of the children's hospital tomorrow afternoon," Charles said during one of his more alert periods.
"That cannot be cancelled.
Those children have been looking forward to this for months." James found himself marveling at the king's continued focus on his duties even while facing what was clearly a serious health crisis. The dedication that had driven Charles through 50 years of public service was still intact, even as his body struggled with the demands he continued to place upon it. Dr. Henley emerged from her consultations with the other physicians as dawn was breaking over the castle grounds. Her expression was serious but not panicked as she approached James and Sarah, who had maintained their watch throughout the night. The initial tests suggest that His Majesty experienced what we call a transient ischemic attack, essentially a minor stroke. The good news is that there doesn't appear to be any permanent damage. The concerning news is that this type of episode is often a warning sign of more serious cardiovascular issues. James felt a mixture of relief and continued worry. What does this mean for his schedule? For his ability to continue his duties? With proper management, medication, lifestyle modifications, reduced stress, His Majesty should be able to continue many of his activities. But the demanding schedule he's maintained may need to be significantly modified. As the sun rose on what would become known within the royal household as the day everything changed, James looked out at the grounds of Windsor Castle and thought about the profound responsibility he had accepted when he took the oath to protect the king. Yesterday, that protection had meant being ready to respond to external threats. Today, it meant helping a dedicated monarch find a way to serve his people while acknowledging the limitations that age and health had imposed upon him. Charles emerged from his bedroom that morning looking frail but determined. The results of the medical tests had been explained to him, and he had accepted Dr. Henley's recommendations for ongoing treatment with the same dignity he had shown throughout his decades of public service. James, he said as they prepared for a carefully modified schedule that would begin with a brief statement to the press about a minor health episode that required some adjustments to his upcoming engagements. Yes, Your Majesty? Thank you. For yesterday evening, for last night, for seeing what needed to be done and doing it. That kind of service goes far beyond duty. James felt the weight of the king's gratitude and the responsibility it represented. Sir, it was an honor to serve when you needed it most. As they prepared to face the challenges that this new reality would bring in the media speculation, the modified schedules, the ongoing health management, James knew that his role in the king's life had been permanently transformed. He was no longer just a protector, he had become a guardian of both the king's physical well-being and his dignity in the face of human frailty. It was a responsibility that would define the rest of his service to the crown and would forever link his name to one of the most vulnerable and ultimately human moments in the reign of King Charles III.